Well, the last thing I want to do is indulge political topicality. Yuck. But it seems people won't shut the fuck up about it no matter where I go. So I'm going to join in the chorus of complaining or schadenfreude, whichever side you fall on, in reference to the American scene, at least right now. The last, 11 days, it's been schadenfreude versus weeping. And I think both are silly for numerous reasons, one of which I'm going to link to, and I'm going to read, because as always, I don't have enough confidence that people are actually going to follow the link and read the article, so I feel the need to convert the article into audio form. And then I'll add on some commentary after that. So it's about a 5-minute read article. Hope you have patience. Author is Scott Alexander. The site is his own blog called Slate Start Codex. And it's a great blog. One of the few blogs I still frequent. So the title of this post, and I haven't requested his permission to read this out loud, but I'm pretty sure, as any other blogger wouldn't mind, I'm pretty sure he wouldn't mind either. But the title of this post is Tuesday Shouldn't Change the Narrative. And this was published on November 7th of 2016. And if you had told me when I read it, and I did read it on the 7th, the day before the election, if you had told me that I would be recording this on November 19th, 11 days after the results of the election, I would have called you a bold-faced liar. Because I was certain, I was absolutely certain that while there was going to be a lot of pandemonium, I was sure the pandemonium would die within a couple of days following the election. But here we are, almost 2 weeks removed, and it's all anyone's talking about. At least 95% of my activity stream. I can't get away from these things. And I've done my best throughout much of the election season, the election cycle, to avoid all of this electoral hoopla. Because it's not that unique of an election. I maintain to this day it wasn't really that unique of an election. The whole system is set up so that quote-unquote unqualified figures can join, can run. People who can just pop out of the blue and finance themselves are welcome to do so. That's what the American electoral season is, I'm almost tempted to say, predicated on. That you don't have to have this history in the system, in the swamp, if you will, to be able to make it to the upper echelons. So I don't think there was anything all that unique about this electoral cycle. Nonetheless, 95% of the things I see in my feed, in my recommendations, disagree with that, whether positive or negative. They think it's the greatest thing since sliced bread, or it's the worst thing ever. So let's just read this, because it perfectly encapsulates why that's not the case. Or at least why it doesn't reveal anything about the national character. Titled, Tuesday Shouldn't Change the Narrative. And before I even begin, I should probably point out that we shouldn't even engage in these grand narratives to begin with, but I'll probably make that point in a separate video. Okay, so the site 538 predicts Hillary has a 65% chance of winning the election to Trump's 35%. New York Times says it's more like 84% Hillary and 16% Trump. Both sites agree both candidates will get somewhere between 40% and 50% of the popular vote, and that Hillary seems to lead Trump by 3%. Smart money's on Hillary, but at this point, either major candidate could win. Lots of things can happen tomorrow. Maybe it rains in Philadelphia. The city's racially diverse and left-leaning voters stay home. And Pennsylvania goes for Trump, winning him the election. Maybe there's a real good get-out-the-vote campaign among Hispanics, and Florida ends up being Trump 48, Hillary 52, instead of the projected Trump 52, Hillary 48. Maybe the Department of Agriculture announces that Hillary is under investigation for bringing exotic weevil species into the U.S., and the population turns against her en masse. And someone is going to confuse this kind of stuff with a deep insight into the state of the country. In June 2016, John Wiener of The Nation wrote, "Relax, Donald Trump can't win," about how the media is incentivized to make racists look competitive, but an understanding of political fundamentals proved that there was no way for Trump to actually make it. On the other hand, a few days ago, Scott Adams reiterated his long-standing prediction of a 98% chance Trump wins in a landslide. I'm worried that one of these two things will happen on Wednesday. Either Hillary wins, and everybody agrees that John Wiener and various other people like him were right, that the fundamentals made a Trump win impossible, and that Trump was a random clown who never had a chance anyway, and that the people who warned us to beware of Trump were crying wolf, that this proves that nationalism is a spent force in politics, etc. Or Trump wins, and everybody agrees that Scott Adams was a genius, that Wiener was an idiot, that Trump is a brilliant master puppeteer, that this proves that the 21st century will be a century of renewed nationalist power, and that the white working class is sexist, that elites need to realize the precariousness of their position within a democratic system, or whatever. Imagine that the deciding factor really is a rainstorm in Philadelphia. There was a rainstorm in Philly, therefore, nationalism is one of the great motivating forces in human affairs. It was a clear sunny day in Philly, therefore nationalism doesn't matter anymore. The difference between nationalism being all-powerful and irrelevant is whether there was a cold front over the mid-Atlantic region. But with a race this close, any deciding factor is going to be about as random as a rainstorm over Philadelphia. Maybe the pollsters made some kind of a big mistake and missed shy Trump voters, and the vote goes Trump 47%, Hillary 45%, instead of the predicted 47% Hillary, 45% Trump. So what? The difference between a proof of nationalism's vigor versus proof of its impotence is which candidate gets 47% versus 45%? Really? If a Trump victory tomorrow would convince you that X is true, I suggest that you believe X is true regardless of whether or not Trump wins, because Trump's victory almost certainly will depend more on noise than on X. If a Hillary victory tomorrow would convince you that Y is true, I suggest you believe Y is true regardless of whether or not Hillary wins, for that same reason. If there's some Z that you will believe only if Trump wins, but not if Hillary wins, then I suggest you seriously reconsider what thought process led you to decide that you will flip your views on politics and society depending on whether or not there's a rainstorm or a 2% polling error or whatever. Instead, I suggest people pre-commit to their views on politics and society now. We live in a country and a world where Hillary can be about at 47% and Trump at about 45%. This is pretty much all you need to know. It suggests that a lot of people are willing to support a nationalist candidate and that a lot of people really hate that candidate. It suggests that political fundamentals are totally compatible with a situation where either Trump or Hillary could win based on noise in the electoral process. Unless the polls are totally wrong and one candidate somehow wins in a 20 percentage point landslide or something. It also suggests that both Wiener and Adams were wrong to be so confident in their respective predictions. If either one is right, it will be mostly by luck. Wiener tells us to relax because Trump can never win, and maybe Trump doesn't win. But the fact is that even if Trump loses, we were one Hillary gaffe away from the opposite result and shouldn't have relaxed at all. Adams says there's been a 98% chance of a Trump win since last year, but the polls make it look a lot like Trump only has a chance at all because of the total coincidence of Hillary getting hit by a new FBI investigation 2 weeks before Election Day. I already count both Wiener and Adams as having been proven wrong regardless of what happens tomorrow. Any further praise or condemnation launched at one or the other after the election is just interpreting noise, or at least a signal so subtle that it might as well be noise. If both Wiener's extreme pro-Hillary prediction and Adams' extreme pro-Trump prediction are bad, what would the good prediction look like? In January of this year, I predicted that, conditional on Trump winning the Republican primary, he would have a 20% chance of winning the election. Well, Trump won the Republican primary, and today, the day before the election, the prediction markets give Trump's chance of winning as 17.9%. If Trump wins anyway, I'll have egg on my face and it'll look bad when I grade my prediction accuracy next year. But I don't think I would fundamentally update the way I think about America or the way I make predictions. No prediction can account for every rainstorm. I think I got the fundamentals right, and if I end up losing on noise, I can at least take solace in knowing that is soon to be the least of our problems. Edit, I agree that election results can obviously change the future. Maybe if Trump wins, he'll enact nationalistic policy that'll make people more nationalist. But the results shouldn't change our interpretation of existing trends. End article. It actually says shared the article, so I don't feel bad for not asking his permission, because that's kind of what I'm doing by reading it. So, the point of all this is to tell people to cut the melodrama. And cut excessive celebrations as well. Whatever you've been doing for the last 11 or 12 days, or however many days it is until I upload this video. I usually don't upload on the day that I record. I usually wait a few days. It's just what I do. So, if you have a problem with that, let me know. I want to hear the arguments. I want to hear why this does reveal something about the character of America, which in and of itself is a silly thing to say, because America is really 50 different states split across 11 distinctly different cultures. I mean, as someone who lives in BC, Canada, I'm noticing that the average fellow Vancouverite has far more in common with the average person from Portland, even though it's two different countries. Right? But they have far more in common in terms of attitudinal disposition, political preferences, etc., etc. The average person from Portland, the average Vancouverite. Far more in common than the average person from Portland has with the average person from Oklahoma, even though they're both Americans. So, national character is, I don't know, if we're evaluating a country like the US, it's a bit of a misnomer, I think. But about that nationalism, we know immigration was a wedge issue for a lot of people. And so, to those who not only view it as something that doesn't warrant wedge issue status, and I count myself as one of the people who thinks it's fairly important, but it shouldn't be a wedge issue. I mean, if you're going to have a wedge issue when it comes to an election like this, it should be a wedge issue that takes into account that the US and Russia account for 93% of nuclear stockpile on the global level. Well, somewhere between 92 and 93% is the last figure I saw. Just two countries, and they account for nearly all of the global nuclear stockpile. That's some serious business. So if you're going to have a wedge issue, and if you're a proponent of civilization thriving, which is a can of worms on its own, because it can only be accompanied by the natural habitat thriving, but I digress. If you're a proponent of perpetuating everything, whether it's in the form of Darwinian life or civilizational life, whichever, if you believe in that, then your wedge issue should have probably been ensuring that Cold War 2.0 does not even tentatively morph into a hot war. Because the two leading superpowers, or at least what can be summarized as superpowers in the traditional sense, account for 92% of the nuclear stockpile. It's insane. It's insane. That's all I can say. And when you look at Hillary Clinton talking about no-fly zone in Syria, where Russian interests reside, that's a recipe for disaster. And I've been noticing that people mock that. A lot of people who believed Hillary was the lesser of evils just come up with this hand-wavy attitude and just mock that concern away, like it's a conspiratorial concern that Hillary was engaging in what can reasonably be characterized as reckless rhetoric on the topic of Syria and on the topic of responding to a cyber threat as though it's like any other threat, or a cyber attack as though it's any other type of attack, responding with military force. Like I said, it strikes me as reckless rhetoric, and I haven't seen anyone assess it in a sober manner and explain why it's something other than reckless rhetoric. They just mock people who are concerned about statements of that nature, who are concerned about a potential no-fly zone in Syria that would have been accompanied by a Hillary victory, or at least in a higher likelihood than by a Trump victory. Of course, Trump has his own can of worms type statements, but this is the one I'm narrowing in on right now, because if you're going to have a wedge issue, it's a sort of wedge issue that would have been met with the immediate aftermath of the election, because of just how much meddling Russia did engage in when it came to this electoral cycle. So she might have had vengeance on her mind, or something of that nature, if she were to follow through on the no-fly zone. And so I'm asking in earnest, I really am, why is that a silly conspiratorial concern to have? I haven't seen anyone explain that. If you've got a link to an article or anything, I don't care how long it is, please link me to it, because I'd like to educate myself in the event that I haven't been going to the right places to look for education on that question. But I think I've covered my bases. Nonetheless, it doesn't hurt to ask. Maybe there's someone more knowledgeable. It's geopolitics. I certainly don't have a clean record when it comes to geopolitical prescriptions, so I'm always looking to update my beliefs on that sort of stuff. So if you think it's just a slam dunk that a Hillary Clinton victory would have been better geopolitically than a Trump victory, give me the analysis, A to Z analysis, and I'll be happy to read it over. But see, now that can make for a wedge issue that I would find reasonable. I don't think immigration, especially when it comes to the American scene, is in dire need of reform to a point where you treat it as a wedge issue, or a lexicographic standard upon which to vote in favor of one person. Nonetheless, the border question poses interesting dilemma in my view, because when you hear talks of deportation, what could possibly justify deporting 11 illegals? You ask that question to me. Nothing in the current scene, in the current American scene. But if you ask that sort of question and you pose it surrounding the well-being of a country that is suffering from mass influx, mass influx of illegal immigrants, we can make the case that that influx can be curbed if a lot of illegals start being deported. So it's not respecting law for law's own sake, because the law itself can never have intrinsic moral worth. Laws are always instrumental. Laws are rules of thumb. Not absolute rules, but rules of thumb. Rules, like duties, like obligations, are meant to be broken. And it is only when breaking them so frequently as to generate overall negative consequences on balance, it is only then that you ought to take it more seriously. So in the States, we're not at that point yet, to the point where we have to disincentivize new illegals by way of deporting old illegals. And yet the people who are voting with immigration in mind as the wedge issue, overwhelmingly, at least the ones I've spoken to about this, they treat the law itself as if it has intrinsic moral worth. They are moral legalists, or legal moralists. And that's a silly view, because then you pretty much have to say that rules are not meant to be broken, ever. And a bunch of dead guys, the political preferences of a bunch of dead guys who wrote the Constitution should have overriding normative force in the year 2016. I don't think that's the case at all. But it does open up other questions about nationalism. Now we can split hairs and discuss civic nationalism versus vulgar nationalism. There's all sorts of different nationalisms. And I think the sober position here is one that says the nation state in the world that we live in right now is far from obsolete. Strictly because we don't want to collapse the welfare state. Right? It has nothing to do with viewing certain people born of certain nationalities as less morally relevant than your fellow countrymen. It simply has to do with a pragmatic argument that if there are no borders whatsoever, people will flock to the most affluent nations and will collapse their welfare states. This is why, traditionally, on the American right, the minarchist and decentralist ideologues have always had a hard-on for mass immigration and open borders. Because, at least the most hardcore paladins of that position, their endgame was to collapse the welfare state, to prove how precarious the welfare state is. And what better way to do so than through open border madness? But they never came out and said that directly, but you can infer it. Actually, I think Hobbes did. Hobbes did all but say that in a passage, and I'll try to look it up and link it in the description of this video. So that's one reason. The other reason is ideological incompatibility creates all sorts of combustible elements in the social sphere. And for those of us who might, in a self-congratulatory manner, for those of us who might refer to ourselves as Islamo-realists, as opposed to Islamo-obfuscators, or obscurantists on the topic of Islam, we know that really that's the elephant in the room when it comes to this. Importing individuals who, on average, have far more retrograde views than their monotheistic counterparts in the way of Middle Eastern Christians. So my simple prescription for asylum seekers, because that obviously ties into the topic of immigration. My prescription for asylum seekers is, say that there's just a fixed amount we can take. What that amount might be, I don't know. Let's just ballpark it at 10,000 within, whatever, a 6-month span. So every 6 months we can take in 10,000. And we have the ultimate lie detector that's bulletproof. That's not the case right now, but for the sake of the argument, entertain that prospect. So we can take 10,000 every 6 months, and we have the lie detector. So do we put that lie detector to use in the vetting process? Or do we just go eeny, meeny, miny, mo? Right? Or let's take it further. You have 10,000 asylum seekers who are Middle Eastern Christians. And you got 10,000 asylum seekers who are Middle Eastern Muslims, self-professed Muslims, devout Muslims. Do you just pick one and the other, and then one and the other, or eeny, meeny, miny, mo on each and every single pick? Or do you go fully for the group that's empirically proven to contain less prickly views, ideologically speaking? The group that has been proven to be more ideologically compatible with the average Westerner. Mind you, not completely innocuous, ideologically speaking, because there's no such thing as a completely innocuous ideology. Hell, there's no such thing as a completely innocuous secular system of ethics, much less religious worldview. Ethical systems are about justifying one trade-off at the expense of the other. As long as there are moral patience, there will be ethical misfortunes for one person or another. So there's no 100% benign system of ethics. Be that as it may, you have two groups. One group does not get taken in by forced arranged marriages, honor killings, FGM, and all sorts of other conservative stupidity, socially conservative stupidity. The other group, the Muslim group, is far more prone to these things, as we are seeing with France, Germany, Sweden, and a lot of the combustible elements in the social realm in those nations as a result of having taken in many of these en masse in a non-discriminatory way. Basically, what I'm trying to get at is we shouldn't just flip a coin in determining what kind of Middle Easterner gets in, if we can help it. If we have the lie detector or the magic wand that can ensure us, when someone says they are Christian, they're not lying, they are a Christian, or better yet, irreligious fully, but for the sake of averages, I'm just going to say Christian versus Muslim, asylum seeker. Well then, I maintain that it would be masochistic to, in the name of non-discrimination, pick a coin, allow a coin toss to determine which one of them we take in, provided we can't take in everyone. There's a finite amount we can take in. That shouldn't be controversial, and it is, because people mix up ideological discrimination, which arguably shouldn't even be referred to as discrimination, but people mix it up because they think ideology is in some way inherent to the person's identity. But, of course, worldviews are not fixed, they are fluid, and neither is a personality for that matter, but there are certain things, there are certain traits individuals cannot change, and there are certain traits about them they can change. And the discrimination that any sober commentator should draw a line on is the sort of discrimination when it comes to unalterable traits, not ideologies, not religions. I know you can get sanctimonious about the freedom of religion, the freedom to religion, and all these constitutional high-minded principles. That's your prerogative, but then you're just concerned, you out yourself as being someone who is more concerned with honoring the good as opposed to advancing the good. This is one way to summarize fundamental differences between consequentialist assessments and non-consequentialist assessments. So, let me hear why your non-consequentialist assessment of honoring the good should trump promoting the good. Let me hear why. And let me hear why a road to hell paved with good intentions, why I just have to eat that and roll over. What? So much the worse for those of us who don't like it hot? I don't think so. No, you're going to get pushback on that. And this is why many of these arguments ultimately boil down to this tension between individuals who are far more concerned with honoring the sacred, having political sacred cows that they view as inviolable, versus those of us who are willing to violate every last sacred cow. Those of us who are comfortable with being hostage to circumstances. Now that said, this doesn't mean that nativism or any other form of nationalism is the way to go. It simply means that the nation state is, in 2016, not obsolete. For the nativist, this is the sort of moral dilemma that the nativist would say, would use to view someone like me as a traitor. So if I'm on a motorboat and there are two individuals drowning on the left side of the pond, and there's one individual drowning on the right side of the pond. And on the right side of the pond, the person who's drowning is my fellow countryman. On the left side of the pond, the two individuals drowning are foreigners who are just here for a visit. And they are tourists. And I know for a fact that all these drowning victims, potential drowning victims, none of them are a social malice. They're all equally ideologically innocuous, or precarious or whatever, pernicious, whatever the spectrum is, they are on equal footing. Their views are equally benign or troublesome. So I can't discriminate on the basis of potentially stupid things they might vote for in the future, or being leeches, or going on welfare, or anything of the sort. Right? All three of them are equal in that respect, respective capabilities. But one of them is my fellow countryman. Two of them, perfect strangers, foreigners. Which way do I go first? Do I save the two foreigners first, or do I save the countrymen first? Do I make a one for the sacrifice of two type trade-off, so as to honor my fellow countrymen like a true patriot would? Or do I look at the numbers? Do I shut up and multiply? Well, I believe I should shut up and multiply, to the nativists' chagrin. And I view the exact same calculus. And it is precisely that sort of calculus that runs afoul of in-group, out-group assessments. So there's a resurgence of in-group, out-group assessments on the American end of things, and you can also say European end of things. And many people are taken in by this because of the ideological factor. And they don't realize that in doing so, in going along for that ride, the ultimate motives of the people who are taking them along for that ride, the neo-reactionary movement, not the alt-right. The alt-right is just infantry. The actual military strategists, neo-reactionaries, the intrinsic worth there is loyalty to the in-group, which doesn't necessarily have to translate to out-group hostility, right? You can have in-group loyalty and out-group apathy. Now, maybe with some alt-right members and neo-reactionaries, it does morph into flat-out out-group hostility, but that would be the least charitable interpretation. The most charitable interpretation is that it's in-group loyalty and out-group apathy. But it's certainly not any degree of equal concern among the in-group and the out-group when all else is equal. And that's irrational. Because then you are pretty much saying something like the Rawlsian veil of ignorance is silly. And for those who may not be familiar with it, Rawlsian veil of ignorance pretty much tells you to, when assessing the sort of political system we want to exist in, you assess it in a prenatal state, without actually knowing what group you're going to be born in, or hell, even what country you're going to be born in. You not know what caste you're going to be born in, what ethnicity you're going to be born to, biological sex. You don't know any of these things. And it is behind that veil of ignorance that you construct a system, so that you don't fall prey to bias. But many people are now making a hobby horse out of intellectualizing bias in favor of the in-group. And I don't understand why that's made a comeback, other than the muddying of the waters between the ideological factors, and it makes perfect sense to discriminate on the basis of fucked up ideologies, to keep them out of societies that have seen a decline of fucked up ideologies, on balance. But like I said, there are ulterior motives when it comes to some of these groups, because it is the in-group, out-group worldview in and of itself, even with all else being equal. So, what's the argument? I am begging for someone to give me the argument that because the one person drowning on the right side of the pond is my fellow countrymen, that should be the overriding factor as to why I should move rightward with the motorboat and ignore the two. Because then you can apply the exact same in-group, out-group thinking to when there's 10 people on the other side, or 20 people, or 100 people drowning on one side, all of whom happen to be members of the out-group, but ideologically innocuous, or at least every bit as innocuous as the individual on the right side of the pond, who is party of 1. You can say party of 100 versus party of 1, with all else being the same. The only difference is the party of the party of the 100 consists of tourists, whereas the party of 1 is a fellow countryman. So, I'm a very bad patriot, but yes, I would indeed move leftward on that score. Because we have granted, for the sake of the thought experiment, that ideologically there is an equal footing. And the only reason the nation-state is not obsolete, or at least one of the two big reasons, is because in reality there is no equal footing. But we are allowed to indulge abstractions because of the philosophical undercurrents of stuff like neo-reaction. And of course with neo-reaction it goes beyond nations, and we do get into ethno-fetishism, or ethno-egoism, if you will. And it seems to me that one can be totally sympathetic to things like hereditarianism, right? So descriptive racism, without using the descriptiveness to morph their ideology into prescriptive racism, aka my own ethnic tribe is morally relevant and everyone else is morally irrelevant. Or at least even a marginal harm to my in-group is unjustifiable, no matter if it's accompanied by a humongous benefit to the outgroup. Like sacrificing one countryman for 100 foreigners, by steering toward the foreigners first and foremost, and then hopefully making it to the countryman on time before he drowns. Seems very straightforward. It's never a good idea to politicize your identity or anything about you. And it seems that all politics in America at this time are identity politics, from every which way. If you want to fight identity politics, don't use identity politics. Two wrongs are not going to make a right in this sense. You fight identity politics with something like the Rawlsian veil of ignorance. It's the best way to do it.